As a quick aside before we get started, if you hear rain and thunder and all sorts of background noise today, there is a storm brewing and raging right now where I live, and we are under a tornado watch. So, hooray! But the work must continue. So, apologies for any background noise you hear this morning. Onto our topic at hand. The reactions to the accusations made against Pope Francis of the delict of heresy continue to come in, and some of the reactions are very measured, while others feature poorly thought out arguments that aren't even defensible, let alone publishable. You've probably seen or heard about some of these, including the spats brewing between Catholic internet celebrities, or the spirited defenses made about the statement by all kinds of figures, or even the attacks on the signers and their intentions made by similar kinds of people. It was all to be expected, of course. One criticism that was a perfectly fair criticism was made by several figures, which essentially boiled down to the signers of the statement should have taken their complaints to the Pope privately first instead of going public now. It is a criticism made by, for example, the Vice President of the Center of Legal Studies at the Center for Family and Human Rights, CFAM, Stefano Gennarini. It's a fair criticism, and as it turns out, is precisely what happened first, though, to be sure, not by the particular authors of the statement. Recall that there has been almost a steady stream of stories appearing in the news since about 2014 asking the Pope to clarify Statement X or to defend Orthodox Position Y. This position has itself almost become the mantra of the conservative side of the Church, as much as give the Pope the benefit of the doubt or never ever question anything that specifically this Pope does has become the mantra of the modernists. There have been about 20 cases that we know of where the Pope was asked for clarifications on his statements since 2014. We'll go over a few of those today, as well as the real canonical grounds for questioning the actions of a Pope, because you do have that right. I'm not going to go into every single one of the 20 known attempts by clergy and the laity to receive doctrinal clarification from the Holy See on various bizarre statements or written teachings of this Pope. That would take too much time. If you want to see the full list, a link to the LifeSite article on this topic is found on the Sources blog. Instead, we'll have a look at a couple of different examples. You'll see a common theme just from those two. The first comes from July 2016, when rather famously, 45 clergy and scholars published their letter to the cardinals of the Catholic Church, in which they, quote, request that the cardinals and patriarchs petition the Holy Father to condemn the errors listed in the document in a definitive and final manner and to authoritatively state that Amoris Laetitia does not require any of them to be believed or considered as possibly true, end quote. You might remember hearing about this in the news. That letter was a comprehensive look at the errors taught in, or could be inferred by, the contents of Amoris Laetitia. As you can expect, that letter was largely ignored by the Holy See and by the Pope. The second example is, of course, the largely forgotten dubia. On the 14th of November 2016, 4 cardinals published a letter to Pope Francis that they had sent to him privately on the 19th of September, and which was never answered, which then defies the traditions of the relationship between the Pope and his duties to the cardinals. The letter contained the now famous 5 dubia concerning, again, Amoris Laetitia, including the question of those who contract a supposedly second marriage from the civil authorities after a divorce may now receive the sacraments, and as to whether there are still existing intrinsically evil acts. That is, are there actions that are considered evil in and of themselves? The cardinals requested a papal audience, but were, of course, ignored. The 4 dubia cardinals are Cardinals Joachim Meisner, Raymond Burke, Cardinal Caffarra, and Walter Brandmüller. Burke and Brandmüller are the only dubia cardinals still alive to this day. Thereafter, 15 cardinals, archbishops, and bishops individually announced their support for the dubia, among them Cardinals Joseph Zen and William Ike, Archbishop Charles Caput, and Archbishop Luigi Negri. And there remains, to this day, 2.5 years later, no response from the Vatican to the dubia. The common themes you may have noticed in this are twofold. Both focus on Amoris Laetitia, which served as a major wake-up call for many Catholics who are paying attention and understand the consequence to souls that come from changing the moral laws of the Church, and of course, continued silence from Pope Francis. As he said in regards to the Vigano letters, he will not say one word on this subject, though to be accurate, he typically gives homilies about Satan and hell after being accused of the kinds of errors we're talking about here. Accusing your enemies of being servants of the devil is a response, just not the one that the laity are entitled to. Which brings us to this. You, as a member of the laity, do have rights in the church, assuming that your conscience is well formed. We hear often about the follow your conscience rule of life in the church, one that is not so much abused as misapplied in an age of purposely poor catechesis. But the laity do have the right to follow their consciences if they have a well-formed Catholic conscience. This is what we call the sensus fidelium, which is what we're talking about, the sense of the faith, which John Paul II's Catechism defines as, quote, the supernatural appreciation of faith on the part of the whole people, when, from the bishops to the last of the faithful, they manifest a universal consent in matters of faith and morals. Lumen Gentium and the Catechism continue. By this appreciation of the faith, aroused and sustained by the Spirit of truth, the people of God, guided by the sacred teaching authority, receives the faith once and for all delivered to the saints. The people unfailingly adheres to this faith, penetrates it more deeply with right judgment, and applies it more fully in daily life. The foundation of this can be found in Jesus' saying in Matthew 16:18 that the gates of hell will not prevail against it, where it refers to the church, that is, the Lord's people that carries forward the living tradition of essential beliefs throughout history, with the bishops overseeing that this tradition does not pursue the way of error. And yes, I know Matthew 16:18 is also talking about the papacy, but the two are linked. I don't typically cite post-conciliar documents for a number of reasons, including them often just being word salad, but this is the present understanding of the sensus fidelium, which just brings us to this. Sensus Fidei in the Life of the Church is a 2014 Vatican document that provides some clarity for the lay faithful about our rights to resist shepherds who teach heterodoxy or worse. Page 63 of this document provides some direction, and I quote, paragraph 63, alerted by their sensus fidei, individual believers may deny assent even to the teaching of legitimate pastors if they do not recognize in that teaching the voice of Christ, the Good Shepherd. The sheep follow the Good Shepherd because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run away from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. See John chapter 10, verses 4 and 5. For St. Thomas, a believer even without theological competence can and even must resist by virtue of the sensus fidei his or her bishop if the latter preaches heterodoxy. In such a case, the believer does not treat himself or herself as the ultimate criterion of the truth of the faith, but rather, faced with the materially authorized preaching which he or she finds troubling, without being able to explain exactly why, defers assent and appeals interiorly to the superior authority of the universal church. End quote. In other words, you have the right and responsibility to resist bad pastors and bad shepherds. Does this include the Supreme Pontiff? According to St. Robert Bellarmine, Doctor of the Church, it absolutely does. Two quotes from him make this point. The Pope is the teacher and shepherd of the whole Church. Thus, the whole Church is so bound to hear and follow him that if he would err, the whole Church would err. Now, our adversaries respond that the Church ought to hear him so long as he teaches correctly, for God must be heard more than men. On the other hand, who will judge whether the Pope has taught rightly or not? For it is not for the sheep to judge whether the shepherd wanders off, not even and especially in those matters which are truly doubtful. Nor do Christian sheep have any greater judge or teacher to whom they might have recourse. As we showed above, from the whole Church one can appeal to the Pope, yet from him no one is able to appeal. Therefore, necessarily the whole Church will err if the Pontiff would err. St. Robert Bellarmine clearly shows the dangers of a heretical or erroneous Pope. So he continues. Just as it is licit to resist a pontiff who attacks the body, so it is licit to resist him who attacks souls or destroys a civil order or, above all, tries to destroy the Church. I say that it is licit to resist him by not doing what he orders, and by impeding the execution of his will. It is not licit, however, to judge him, to punish him, or to depose him, for these are the acts proper to a superior. End quote. Deposing the Pope is a non-starter, but resisting him is absolutely within our rights. Of course, there are some who say Francis isn't Pope at all. Either way, there is no mechanism to get rid of him. What then does resisting an erroneous pontiff look like? Correcting the record with the laity first. The sensus fidelium only really works if the faithful understand the faith they profess, which these days isn't a guaranteed thing at all. One really only needs to look to the typical Novus Ordo parish, where the statistics show that most people are receiving communion on a weekly basis, while supporting same-sex supposed marriage, legal child slaughter, contraception, condemned political ideologies, politicians who support those things, and, perhaps more importantly on a basic level, rarely going to confession for their sins against the 6th and 9th commandments. Quite frankly, I'm not sure if many Catholics are in a position to question the state of things. I mean, you have to have noticed that most Catholics are completely unaware of the crisis state of the Church right now. Most Catholics don't know that Francis was accused of heresy by a growing list of respected theologians. And at least anecdotally, most Catholics think a pope is protected from error in all things that he does, which is nonsense on stilts. But that is the state of things today, which is why it is your duty to help wake up a few everyday Catholics to the state of the Church. If what I'm advocating here sounds like the recognize and resist or R&R position, I suppose that it is, though I will offer a nod to the main competing position, which is to say that if you are still in the typical Novus Ordo Missae parish, you may want to consider an exit strategy for more traditional grounds. Heterodoxy prevails in many of them, and in many others the tough issues of our times are completely ignored in favor of bland homilies about the personal experiences of parishioners or the priest, and how they vaguely relate to a safe gospel reading. If, as I reported yesterday, the Amazon Synod is as bad as they say it is going to be, or if the Pope does pursue the issue of ordained deaconesses, then every Catholic will need to make the choice about where they receive the sacraments and where they go to Mass. For many of us, that choice already was made long ago. You should be thinking about this, because, as I'm fond of repeating, things are going to get worse before they get any better. Thank you for listening and for your support. If you want to support my work, there are options in the description of this video. I ask that people continue to pray and do acts of penance for the liberation and exaltation of the Church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.